Hello, I'm Peter. I'm so glad you could join me for tonight's journey. There's a particular kind of silence that comes with deep cold. Not the peaceful quiet of a gentle winter evening, but something heavier, something that presses against your chest and slows your breath. Tonight, we're going to explore a world where that silence was the companion of millions, where warmth wasn't a thermostat away, but a carefully guarded secret passed down through generations. Before we begin, I wonder what brought you here tonight. Perhaps the day felt too long, too loud. Perhaps worries about tomorrow kept circling your thoughts, refusing to let you rest. Or maybe you're simply seeking a companion for these quiet hours, a voice to walk with you through the darkness towards sleep. Whatever weighs on your heart tonight, you're welcome here. Let that weight rest for now. We'll carry it together into the past, where perspective often makes our present burdens feel lighter. Now, here's something that might surprise you. If we could step back into a medieval shepherd's shelter on a winter night, you'd likely sleep warmer than you did last night in your modern bed. Not because they had better materials. They didn't. Not because they had thicker blankets. They rarely did. But because they understood something we've forgotten in our age of central heating and electric blankets. They understood that warmth isn't about thickness. It's about air. To truly understand this, we must look at the realities of medieval life. It wasn't just a period of history, it was a daily masterclass in environmental awareness. The shepherds who tended their flocks through medieval winters weren't just surviving. They were masters of thermal physics before anyone called it that. They could sleep through nights where your breath would freeze in the air, where the ground beneath them was harder than stone, where a single mistake meant not waking up at all. And they did it with materials you probably have in your home right now. Before we step into their world, take a moment, if you would, to let me know where you're listening from tonight. Are you nestled somewhere in the heartland, perhaps, feeling that familiar bite of winter air even through your walls? Or are you somewhere warmer, drawn to these stories of cold, for reasons you might not fully understand? Drop a comment below and tell me where in the world you're drifting off from and what time it is where you are. It helps me know I'm keeping you company wherever you might be. And if these quiet journeys through history help you find peace at the end of your day, a gentle tap on the like button would mean the world. Not for the numbers, but because it tells me you're out there listening, sharing these moments of stillness in a world that rarely stops moving. Subscribe if you'd like more of these nighttime wanderings through the past, but only if this feels like home to you. Now, let the weight of the day begin to lift. Adjust your pillow, pull your blanket a little closer, and perhaps dim your screen just slightly. Let your breathing slow to match the pace of my words. We're about to travel back through time to an era when winter wasn't an inconvenience, but a test of everything you knew about survival. And in that harsh world, we'll find warmth in the most unexpected places. The year is 1315. Europe is entering what historians would later call the Great Famine, and the winters are growing colder with each passing season. In the highlands of Scotland, a young shepherd named Callum tends his flock through nights that seem to last forever. His shelter is barely worthy of the name, just stones piled against the wind and a roof of woven branches that let the rain and snow through in a dozen places. Yet, morning after morning, he wakes, not just alive, but warm enough to continue. Callum moves slowly in the dimming light. He knows the wind is shifting, bringing the scent of ice from the north. But he doesn't panic. He remembers the lessons of the old shepherds who sat by the peat fires of his youth. He begins by inspecting the walls of his hut. With practiced fingers, he reaches for a basket of dried moss and a mixture of straw and mud. He meticulously stuffs every tiny gap between the stones. He even uses clumps of matted sheep's hair gathered from the brambles. Each plug of moss is a barrier against the ghost wind that steals the soul's heat. As he works, the whistling of the wind outside begins to soften into a muffled hum. The air inside the small space begins to feel thick, heavy, and strangely still. How the answer lies in something his grandmother taught him when he was barely old enough to remember. The cold doesn't care how thick your blanket is, she would say, her weathered hands demonstrating as she spoke. The cold only cares about the air. Trap the air and you trap warmth. Let the air move and warmth will abandon you like water through a sieve. She taught him that a shepherd's life is a story of layers. She spoke of the highlands of their ancestors, where the men would sleep with their heavy wool cloaks, yes, but also with a nightcap pulled low over their ears. Keep the head warm to keep the feet warm, she'd whisper. Even his shoes were part of the defense, stuffed tightly with dry insulating straw to keep the damp earth from sucking the heat from his toes. As Callum prepares his bed tonight, he feels the weight of this inherited wisdom. It is a slow, methodical process that brings a sense of profound calm. This wasn't poetry. This was physics, though no one in that time would have called it such. Medieval life meant understanding your environment with an intimacy we've lost. These people couldn't Google the thermal conductivity of wool or read studies about insulation values. They learned by watching, by listening, by feeling. And most painfully, they learned by burying those who didn't learn fast enough. You see, in medieval times, winter survival skills weren't optional knowledge. They were the difference between seeing spring and becoming another statistic whispered about in village markets. When historians today write their medieval documentary accounts, they often focus on grand castles and noble feasts. But the real story of medieval survival was written in shepherds' huts and peasant cottages, in the quiet victories of ordinary people who made it through one more impossible night. Let me paint you a picture of what winter truly meant in that era. Imagine you're lying down to sleep, but your bed isn't a bed as you know it. It's a raised platform of rough wood, maybe stuffed with straw if you're fortunate, more likely just bare planks if you're not. There's no mattress, no box spring, certainly no memory foam or pillow top. The room around you, if you can call it that, is barely warmer than the outside air. Frost creeps across the inside of the walls. Your breath forms clouds that hang in the still air. And beneath you, through those wooden planks, you can feel the earth itself drawing heat from your body like a hungry ghost. But there is a sound that brings comfort to this frozen scene. It's the low, rhythmic shuffling of the flock. In the mountains of Wales and the Pyrenees, shepherds often brought their most vulnerable sheep or goats into the shelter with them. As Callum settles down, he hears the soft bleating and the gentle thump of a ewe lying down just a few feet away. Their massive, fleecy bodies are living furnaces, radiating a gentle, musky heat that fills the small room. The smell of wool and hay is earthy and grounding. Together, human and animal share the breath of life, creating a communal pool of warmth that defies the blizzard outside. This is where the first trick begins. so simple you might dismiss it, yet so effective that people who understand it can sleep comfortably in conditions that would leave others hypothermic by midnight. The shepherds learned to place a thin layer of wool, sometimes just the thickness of your finger, directly between their body and whatever surface they slept on. Not thick blankets, not piled fleece, just one thin layer. And here's why that mattered more than all the heavy coverings piled on top. Heat moves through solid objects through a process called conduction. Think of it like this. Imagine you're holding a warm stone in your hand, and slowly that warmth spreads into your palm. That's conduction. Now, when you lie down on a hard surface, even through clothing, your body heat begins conducting into that surface immediately. Earth, stone, wood, they're all hungry for heat, and they'll draw it from you relentlessly all night long. But air, our air, is different. Air is actually one of the worst conductors of heat in existence, which makes it one of the best insulators. The challenge is keeping air still. Moving air wind drafts these steel heat through convection, but trapped air that sits motionless between fibers, between layers, becomes an invisible barrier that heat cannot easily cross. That thin layer of wool the shepherds used did something remarkable. Wool fibers are not smooth. Under magnification, they look like tiny overlapping scales, and between those scales are countless microscopic pockets of air. When you compress wool, when you lie your body weight upon it, you don't crush those air pockets out. The structure of the wool holds them in place. And because wool is protein, because it's made of keratin like your own hair, it also has this almost magical property of absorbing moisture vapor without feeling wet, releasing a tiny amount of heat in the process. So that thin layer beneath your torso isn't just padding. It's a thermal barrier that breaks the direct connection between your warmth and the cold ground's hunger for it. Medieval shepherds who understood this could sleep on frozen ground and wake without the deep, bone-penetrating chill that killed others who relied only on thick blankets above them. There's a documented account from the winter of 1435, recorded by a traveling monk named Brother Thomas in his journal. He described staying with a shepherd family in the Welsh mountains during a particularly brutal cold snap. He wrote, and I'm translating from his medieval Latin here. These people possess a wisdom about coldness that surpasses learned men. They place their bodies not upon straw alone, but upon thin felted wool they call gulan. And though their cottage admitted wind through every crack, they slept as if in summer, while I, with my thick habit, shivered until dawn. Brother Thomas didn't understand what he was witnessing, but he was observing a principle that modern survival experts have only recently rediscovered: ground insulation matters more than top insulation in extreme cold. A lesson written in medieval survival, waiting patiently through the centuries for us to remember it. And here's something that might resonate with you tonight, wherever you're lying as you listen to this. That cold that creeps up from beneath you, that chill that makes you pull your blankets tighter. That's the same cold those shepherds felt. Your central heating, your modern mattress, they've made you comfortable. But they've also made you forget that your ancestors solved this problem with nothing more than understanding and a thin piece of felt. Who were these shepherds? They weren't the characters you see in Christmas pageants, peaceful figures kneeling beside a manger. They were weathered, practical people who spent months at a time in the high pastures, far from villages responsible for animals that represented their family's entire wealth, lose the flock to cold, and you'd lose everything. So they learned, they observed, they remembered, and they survived winters that would challenge even our modern preparations. The medieval documentary evidence we have, the fragments of lives recorded in church records and manor accounts, tell us that shepherds had one of the higher survival rates during extreme winters, higher than farmers who slept in proper houses, higher than craftsmen in towns. And it was precisely because they had to master these fundamental truths about warmth when everything around them conspired toward freezing death. As you lie there tonight, feeling the support beneath, you know that you're connected to this ancient lineage. Every night's sleep is a small survival, a miniature winter endured and conquered. And those who came before us, who had so much less and knew so much more about the fundamentals, they're not so different from you. Just people trying to rest, trying to wake up tomorrow. Just people understanding that sometimes the simplest solutions are the ones that save your life. There's a moment, usually around 3 in the morning, when the earth reaches its coldest point. Ancient shepherds knew this moment intimately. They called it different names in different languages, but the meaning was always the same. The hour when warmth is most precious, when the ground beneath you feels like it's trying to pull the life from your bones. Let me tell you about a practice that sounds almost too simple to matter. Yet it made the difference between waking and never waking at all. In the highlands of medieval Scotland, shepherds would spend weeks at a time in summer pastures called sheilings, temporary settlements far from the main village. These weren't comfortable outposts. They were often nothing more than rough stone circles with turf roofs, barely enough to block the wind. The sleeping platforms inside were just packed earth, sometimes raised slightly, sometimes not. Here's what they did, and why it worked so beautifully. Before laying down for the night, a shepherd would gather dried grass moss, or if fortunate, wool scraps from shearing time. They'd create what seemed like an impossibly thin layer spread across their sleeping area. We're not talking about a thick, comfortable mattress. Sometimes it was barely thicker than your hand laid flat. But the secret wasn't thickness. It was interruption. Think about heat for a moment, not as a thing you can hold, but as energy that's always trying to move from warm places to cold places. It's restless, constantly seeking equilibrium. Your body maintaining its core temperature around 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit is a furnace in comparison to winter ground that might be hovering just above or below freezing. That difference creates a thermal gradient, and heat desperately wants to flow down that gradient from you into the earth. Solid materials conduct heat at different rates. Dense materials like stone or frozen earth are relatively efficient conductors. Wood is better, but still allows significant heat transfer. But fibrous materials that create pockets of trapped air, they're something else entirely. When you place that thin layer of wool or dried grass between your body and the ground, you're not really insulating with the wool itself. You're insulating with the thousands of tiny air pockets within and between the fibers. And here's the crucial part: that layer doesn't need to be thick to work. It just needs to break the direct thermal contact. Medieval shepherds understood this through experience we can barely imagine. A shepherd in the Pyrenees Mountains between France and Spain might lose fingers to frostbite during a winter storm, but he'd rarely freeze to death while sleeping if he'd prepared his bedding correctly. The documents that survive the sparse records kept by monasteries that owned flocks show surprisingly high survival rates among shepherds who knew these techniques. There's an account from 1407 from the records of a monastery in northern England. The prior wrote about one of their shepherd boys, no more than 15, who'd been caught in an early October snowstorm in the high pastures. He'd built a crude shelter by piling stones and covering them with his cloak. But before lying down, even though he was exhausted and freezing, he'd taken the time to cut marsh grass with his knife and spread it beneath where he would sleep. When the other shepherds found him 2 days later after the storm cleared, he was weak from hunger, but perfectly alive, while sheep that had huddled directly against stones were dead from the cold. The prior, being an educated man, didn't understand what he was recording. He attributed the boy's survival to divine providence. But what he was actually documenting was the application of a winter survival skill that had been refined over countless generations, bought with the lives of those who learned too slowly. Let me explain the physics in a way that makes sense without making you think too hard, because tonight is for drifting, not for studying. Imagine warmth as water. Now imagine your body is a bucket with a small hole in the bottom, and that hole is where you contact the ground. Without a barrier, the water drains steadily. But place something over that hole, even something thin, and the drainage slows dramatically. It doesn't stop completely. Nothing could in truly extreme cold. But it slows enough that your body's natural heat production can keep up with the loss. You reach an equilibrium. You stay warm enough to sleep, warm enough to wake. This first layer, this ground barrier, is the foundation of everything else. Medieval life demanded this understanding because there was no backup plan. There was no emergency room waiting to treat your hypothermia. There was only you, the materials you could gather, and the knowledge carried in your family's collective memory. I want you to imagine something as you lie there tonight. Imagine you're that shepherd, feeling the cold earth beneath you, even through your cloak and tunic. You've just spent the day moving your flock to new grazing, perhaps walking 10 or 15 miles over rough terrain. Your body aches. You're hungry because food is scarce this time of year. The sun has set and the temperature is plummeting. You know from stories told around winter fires, from warnings passed down from older shepherds now gone, that lying directly on the ground tonight might mean never seeing morning. So you gather materials. Your hands are cold enough that they're clumsy, but you work anyway. Grass, moss, some old fleece that's been felted by rain and sun into something almost like fabric. You spread it carefully in your shelter, this layer so thin it seems almost pointless. But you know, your grandfather knew, his grandfather knew. And so you lie down upon it and you pull your cloak around you and you wait for warmth to find you. And here's the beautiful thing, the thing that connects you across all those centuries to that shepherd. The warmth does come. Not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually as your body heat begins to warm the air, trapped in that thin layer as the barrier does its work, you feel the deadly chill of the ground recede. It's still there, that cold waiting like a patient predator. But it can't reach you anymore. You've built a wall against it, invisible, but real, made of nothing but understanding and a handful of dried grass. This was the first lesson, the foundational knowledge. Everything else built upon this understanding. The medieval survival techniques that we'll explore tonight Each one layers upon this base principle, because you can have the thickest blankets in the world piled on top of you, but if you're losing heat to the ground beneath you, you'll never truly be warm. You'll shiver. You'll toss and turn seeking comfort that doesn't exist. And in extreme cold, that constant heat loss would eventually win. But with this one simple intervention, this acknowledgement that the earth itself is your enemy in winter's darkest hours, you change everything. You give yourself a chance. You give warmth a place to gather instead of draining away into the infinite cold reservoir of the ground. As you settle into sleep tonight, feel the surface beneath you, your mattress, your pillow, the sheets around you. You're so far removed from that shepherd's experience, yet the principle remains the same. Between you and the cold, there must be a barrier. And that barrier is most effective when it traps air, when it creates stillness, when it says to the cold, this far and no further. There's a rhythm to building warmth that humans have understood for thousands of years, a pattern that modern comfort has made us forget. Tonight, we're remembering that rhythm, one layer at a time. Imagine you've survived until now in our shepherd's shelter. You've created your ground barrier, that thin but crucial layer between you and the earth's hunger for heat. Now comes the next lesson, and this one goes against every instinct you might have developed in your modern life. When you're cold, your first impulse is probably to pile on more blankets, to add thickness, to bury yourself under as much material as possible. It seems logical. More equals warmer, right? But the shepherds knew something different. They knew that a single thick blanket lying loose over your body is actually quite poor at keeping you warm. And they discovered something that modern sleeping bag designers wouldn't scientifically confirm until the 1940s, that multiple thinner layers carefully arranged will keep you warmer than one thick layer, even if the total amount of material is the same. Let me tell you about a winter technique that was so common in medieval times that almost no one bothered to write it down. We only know about it from a few scattered references and from the memories that survived in remote rural communities well into the 20th century. A shepherd preparing to sleep in cold weather would take whatever blankets or cloaks he possessed, and instead of just throwing them over himself, he would arrange them with careful attention. The first layer placed directly over his clothed body would be pulled snug and then tucked firmly under his sides. Not wrapped like a mummy, but secured so it couldn't shift during the night. Then, a second layer, heavier if possible, would be laid over that, and its edges would be anchored as well, sometimes weighted with stones, sometimes tucked under the sleeping platform's edges, sometimes just carefully folded under the body. What this created was a series of air chambers. Between each layer of fabric, a thin space of air would form, and as your body heat began to radiate outward, that air would warm. Warm air trapped between layers that couldn't shift stayed warm. It became an invisible insulation system, far more effective than the same amount of fabric piled loosely. There's a reason this technique was never forgotten by soldiers until very recently. In the trenches of World War I, men who'd never been shepherds rediscovered these medieval winter survival tricks through desperate trial and error. The ones who survived wrote letters home, describing how they'd learned to layer their blankets, to trap air between them, to create what they called the pocket of warmth. One letter, preserved in the Imperial War Museum in London, describes this beautifully. A corporal named William Marsh, writing to his sister in January 1916 from France, explains, Sarah, you asked how we bear the cold. I'll tell you what old Jenkins taught us, him being a shepherd from Wales before the war. He says, "Make a nest, not a pile," says his father told him and his grandfather before that. You take each blanket and you make it tight around you, like and tuck the edges so wind can't get in. Then another over that, and you're building walls of warm air sea, not walls of wool, walls of air. Sounds mad, but I'm warmer with 2 blankets his way than with 4 the way I used to do it. William Marsh survived the war. Many of his comrades didn't. And while you can't attribute survival solely to understanding how to sleep warm, it certainly played its part. Hypothermia weakens you. It makes you susceptible to disease. It saps your will to keep going. The men who stayed warmer stayed healthier, stayed stronger, had better chances of making it home. But let's return to our medieval shepherd, because there's more to this layering trick than just trapping air. There's a psychological element too. Something about creating a boundary between yourself and the hostile world outside your cocoon of warmth. When you're alone in a shelter barely worthy of the name, when wind finds every crack and gap, when darkness is absolute, because there's no electricity, no street lights, no ambient glow from civilization, the cold becomes more than physical. It becomes oppressive. It feels personal, like the universe itself is trying to erase you. Creating these layers, taking the time to arrange them properly, it's a way of fighting back. It's a way of saying, I will not be erased. I will create a space within this hostile environment where I can exist, where I can rest, where I can gather strength for tomorrow. Medieval documents occasionally give us glimpses of this psychological warfare against winter. A poem from the 14th century written in Middle English includes these lines: "When colder wind bites and frost does creep, I make my nest for gentle sleep. Each cloth laid close, each edge made fast, till warm shall come and cold has passed." The poet understood. This wasn't just about physical survival. It was about maintaining hope, about refusing to surrender to despair. Because when you're truly cold, when you can't get warm, it affects your mind as much as your body. You begin to believe you'll never be warm again. You lose the will to keep trying. But when you feel warmth returning, when you sense your efforts working, when the air between your carefully arranged layers begins to hold and amplify your body's heat, something in you strengthens. You remember that you have power even in powerlessness. You remember that knowledge applied with care can triumph over circumstance. Let me describe the sensation, because it's important to understand how this progression feels. You've laid your ground barrier. You've positioned your first layer of covering, pulled it close, tucked it secure. You add the second layer and immediately you feel less exposed, even though you're not yet warm. Then, and this is the crucial moment that every cold weather survivor knows, you must be patient. You must resist the urge to keep adding layers immediately, to keep adjusting, to keep moving in search of instant comfort. Because warmth, true warmth, takes time to build. Your body is producing heat, constantly about 100 watts of power, roughly the same as an old-fashioned incandescent light bulb. But that heat needs time to fill the spaces you've created to warm the air in those invisible chambers between your layers. So you lie still. You control your breathing. You let your body do its work. And after perhaps 10 minutes, perhaps 15, you begin to feel it. A subtle warming. Not dramatic, not sudden, but undeniable. The cold that was pressing in from all sides begins to retreat. The air closest to your skin warms first, Then the warmth spreads outward through the layers. Soon, you're not shivering anymore. Your muscles can relax. Your jaw unclenches. And sleep, which seemed impossible just minutes ago, becomes not only possible, but inevitable. This is the gift of layering the ancient wisdom of creating chambers of trapped warmth. And the beautiful thing is, you can experience this tonight right now, wherever you are. If you're lying under blankets as you listen, try this instead of having them piled loosely. Take a moment to arrange them more deliberately. Pull the first layer snug against you. Tuck it under your sides. Then add another layer and let it drape over the first, creating that air gap. You might find even in your climate-controlled home that this simple adjustment makes you more comfortably warm than you've been in months. Because these techniques don't require primitive conditions to work. They work with physics, and physics doesn't change just because we've invented central heating. Air still insulates. Trapped air still resists heat transfer. Your body still produces the same amount of warmth it always has. The principles the shepherds learned, they're as valid tonight as they were 600 years ago in a drafty stone shelter in the Scottish Highlands. As you feel your own warmth building around you now, as you sense sleep drawing closer, remember, you're not alone in this experience. You're part of an unbroken chain of humans who learned to find warmth in impossible places, who refused to let cold defeat them, who passed their knowledge on, so that you tonight can rest in comfort. In the deepest part of night, when even your dreams seem to slow and deepen, your body is engaged in a constant unconscious battle. It's fighting to keep your core temperature stable, to protect the vital organs that sustain your life. And long before modern medicine understood this process, medieval shepherds had learned to work with it, to help their bodies win that nighttime battle against the cold. This next technique is perhaps the most elegant of all, because it uses your own body's wisdom against the cold's assault. Your body doesn't heat evenly. This might seem obvious when you think about it, but the implications are profound. Your core, your torso, houses your heart, lungs, liver, kidneys. These organs are your survival priority, and your body knows it. When you're cold, your body will sacrifice your fingers, toes, even your limbs to keep your core warm. It's brutal but logical. You can survive without a few fingers. You can't survive if your heart stops. Medieval shepherds, through observation and dire necessity, learned to support their body's natural priorities. They developed a wrapping technique that seems almost counterintuitive until you understand the reasoning behind it. Instead of trying to warm everything equally, they focused on creating what we might now call a thermal core. Using their outermost blanket or cloak, they would wrap it around their shoulders, chest and hips, almost like a thick scarf, then tuck and fold the excess material underneath their back and legs. This created a sort of personal cocoon that was tighter around the trunk of the body and looser toward the extremities. Why does this work so much better than just pulling a blanket up to your chin? Heat radiates from your body in all directions. When you're lying flat with a blanket simply draped over you, much of that heat escapes out the sides, dissipating into the cold air of the room. It's like trying to heat a space with an open window. The warmth just keeps flowing out, never accumulating. But when you wrap the material around your core and fold it back beneath you, you're creating a closed system. The heat your torso generates has nowhere to escape. It cycles within the wrapped space, gradually warming not just the air, but the fabric itself. Soon the warmth begins to feel almost solid, like you're lying in a pocket of summer air despite the winter surrounding you. There's an account from the Norse sagas, those epic stories from medieval Iceland and Scandinavia, that mentions this technique. In the saga of Grettir the Strong, there's a passage describing how the hero survives alone on a deserted island through a terrible winter. The saga tells us he would bind his cloak close about his body and fold it beneath him, making a nest that held warmth as a stone holds heat from the day's sun. Grettir was a literary character, but the saga was written by people who knew winter intimately. That detail about binding and folding wasn't invented for dramatic effect. It was included because the audience would have recognized it as a real technique, something that separated those who understood cold weather survival from those who didn't. In the harsh winters of medieval Iceland, where wood was scarce and peat fires gave only modest warmth, every household would have known this method. Children learned it as naturally as they learned to walk. Fail to understand it, and you might not survive to adulthood. Before the final wrap, there is one more secret Callum employs. Near the center of the hut, a small fire had been burning throughout the evening. Nestled in the cooling embers are several large, flat river stones. He doesn't touch them with bare hands. He uses a scrap of leather to pull them out. They have drunk deeply of the fire's heat. He wraps these stones in thick, worn cloths, old wool tunics that have seen better days. He places one at the very bottom of his sleeping nest, where his feet will rest, and another tucked near his lower back. The sensation is immediate. It's a sharp, localized heat that radiates through the layers of his bedding. It feels as if the sun itself has been captured and placed under his blankets. This is a common practice from the Scottish borders to the valleys of Wales, the heated stone, or bed brick. As he lies back, he feels the warmth from the stone begin to seep into his bones, loosening the tension in his muscles from a long day of climbing crags. The heat spreads slowly, a gentle, pulsing glow that keeps the dampness of the night at bay. Let me paint you a picture of how this felt, because the physical sensation is important to understanding why this works. Imagine you're that shepherd again. You've arranged your ground layer. You've created your chamber of trapped air with your inner blankets. Now you take your outermost covering, perhaps a heavy wool cloak that's seen many winters, perhaps just a particularly thick blanket woven by your wife or mother. You pull it around your shoulders like you're hugging yourself. Then you wrap it across your chest around your sides. You tuck one edge under your hip roll slightly to work it under your back. The other edge comes across and gets folded under from the other side. Your legs you wrap less tightly, but you still create that folded barrier beneath them. At first, this feels restrictive. You're used to being able to move freely to stretch to adjust position whenever you wish. But you resist the urge to loosen everything. You wait. You breathe. And then usually within 5 or 10 minutes, you feel it happening. Your core warms, distinctly noticeably warms. And here's the magic. Once your core is warm, your body relaxes its defensive posture. Blood flow to your extremities improves. Your hands and feet, which might have been icy when you first lay down, begin to warm as well. Not from external heat, but because your body is no longer rationing warmth, no longer in crisis mode. This principle has been rediscovered repeatedly throughout history, always during times when survival demanded innovation. In the Great Depression of the 1930s, when many families couldn't afford heating, fuel newspapers ran articles about the old-time method of wrapping warm. During World War II, civilians in bombed-out buildings who'd lost their heat would teach each other these techniques that their grandparents had known, but they'd forgotten. A woman named Ellen Morrison, interviewed in the 1980s about surviving the London Blitz, described it like this. "My gran, she'd lived through hard times before she had. She showed me how to do what she called the shepherd's wrap. Said her father learned it from a Scottish fellow who worked sheep. You make yourself small-like and wrap everything tight round your middle and tuck it all underneath you. First night I did it proper. I couldn't believe how much warmer I was. Thought maybe I'd die of the cold in that bombed-out building. But I didn't. Survived till the all clear till we could get rehoused." Ellen survived. She lived to be 92. And while you can't attribute long life to one night's warmth, you can say with certainty that she survived that particular night, because someone had passed down knowledge from the medieval winter survival traditions through generations until it reached her when she needed it most. This technique of creating a thermal core of supporting your body's natural priorities, it reveals something profound about human adaptation. We're not the strongest species. We're not the fastest. We don't have thick fur or layers of blubber, but we have something perhaps more valuable. We observe, we remember, we teach, and we apply understanding to overcome our physical limitations. A shepherd lying alone in the mountains, using nothing but wool and knowledge to survive night after night of brutal cold, was engaged in the same fundamental process as a scientist in a modern laboratory. Both were applying understanding of physical principles to solve problems. The shepherd just couldn't have articulated it in terms of thermodynamics and heat transfer coefficients. But his body knew, his experience confirmed, and his survival proved. As you lie there now, in whatever comfort you've found tonight, your own body is engaged in this same ancient dance. It's directing heat to where it's needed most. It's making calculations about resource allocation that happen far below your conscious awareness. You are, in this moment, no different from that shepherd from Ellen Morrison in her bombed building from Corporal Marsh in his WWI trench. You're a human being, maintaining life, finding warmth in a universe that tends always toward cold and entropy. And isn't there something comforting in that? Something that makes you feel less alone? We're all fighting the same battle, separated by centuries, but united by the simple need to stay warm enough to see tomorrow. Wrap that thought around yourself like an extra blanket. Let it settle into place. And feel how, just by understanding these principles, just by connecting yourself to this long chain of survivors, you become a little warmer, a little more secure, a little more confident that you too will wake when morning comes. There's a wisdom in diversity that humans have always understood, even if they couldn't always explain it. In the natural world, survival often depends on variety, on not putting all your resources in one vulnerable place. And when it comes to staying warm through impossible nights, medieval people knew that mixing materials was better than relying on any single one, no matter how good that material might seem. Tonight, we're exploring the art of combination, the subtle knowledge of when to use cotton, when to use wool, when to use quilted layers, and why mixing them creates something more effective than any single material alone. Let me start with a memory that isn't mine, but one that's been preserved in the written record with such clarity that it almost becomes mine when I read it. In 1847, during the worst winter of the Irish potato famine, a relief worker named William Bennett kept a journal of his travels through Connaught and Mayo, two of the hardest hit regions. He was documenting suffering, trying to bring attention to the crisis. But in one entry, he recorded something that caught his attention precisely because it seemed anomalous. He visited a cottage where a family, despite their desperate poverty, had managed to survive the winter in somewhat better condition than their neighbours. When he asked how the mother showed him their sleeping arrangements, she'd taken every scrap of fabric in the house and layered them in a specific pattern first against their skin-thin cotton garments, next wool blankets, then on top a quilt her mother had made years before when times were better sewn with wool batting inside but covered with tightly woven cotton. She could not tell me why this arrangement worked better. Bennett wrote, only that her grandmother had taught her and her grandmother's grandmother before that. She said the cotton takes the damp from your body, the wool holds the warmth, and the quilt keeps all of it in place. Simple wisdom, she called it. Wisdom that has kept her family alive. What that grandmother's grandmother understood without knowing the science behind it was moisture management and thermal layering. Let me explain this in a way that makes sense without feeling like a lecture, because this is one of the most important principles for cold weather survival, medieval or modern. Your body produces moisture constantly. Even when you're not sweating, even when you're lying perfectly still in sleep, you're exhaling humid air with every breath. You're releasing water vapor through your skin in a process called insensible perspiration. In a warm room, this doesn't matter much. The moisture dissipates harmlessly. But in cold conditions, that moisture becomes your enemy. Water is an excellent conductor of heat. When fabric gets damp, it loses much of its insulating ability because the water fills the air pockets that were keeping you warm. This is why getting soaked in cold weather can kill you so quickly. Your insulation fails, and suddenly all your heat is conducting away through the water-filled fabric. Medieval shepherds and peasants learned through bitter experience that different materials handle moisture differently. Cotton, being a plant fiber, absorbs moisture readily and holds it within the fiber structure. This makes cotton feel damp, which is bad. But crucially, cotton absorbs moisture away from your skin, keeping your immediate skin surface drier. Wool, being a protein fiber made of keratin, does something almost magical. It can absorb up to 30% of its weight in moisture, while still feeling dry and maintaining most of its insulating ability. So when you layer cotton next to your skin, it wicks moisture away. When you layer wool over that, it absorbs the moisture that passed through the cotton, but doesn't collapse or lose its air-trapping structure. And when you top everything with a quilted layer, that outer shell with its tightly woven cover creates a barrier that holds everything in place and prevents air currents from disturbing your carefully constructed thermal system. This wasn't theoretical knowledge for medieval people. It was survival knowledge learned because the alternative was freezing to death. There's a beautiful example of this from the medieval craft guilds. Wool merchants and weavers in medieval England, places like York and Norwich, they didn't just make cloth for profit. They were also users of their own products, and they experimented constantly trying to create the most effective cold weather fabrics they could. Guild records from the 14th century show that master weavers would test different weights of wool, different weaving patterns, different combinations with linen, which behaves similarly to cotton. They'd send samples with shepherds heading to winter pastures, asking for reports on which combinations worked best. This was medieval research and development practical experimentation, driven by life or death need. One guild record from 1398 notes, "The shepherds report that wool of medium weight worn over linen and covered with oiled cloth gives better service than wool alone, even heavy wool. The combination resists both wind and damp, which wool alone does not do as well." Oiled cloth was an early form of waterproofing, treating fabric with linseed oil, or sometimes sheep lanolin to make it shed water. This was the medieval world's answer to Gore-Tex, and while it wasn't perfect, it worked surprisingly well. Now let me bring this forward to something that might seem unrelated, but actually demonstrates the same principle. In World War II, before modern synthetic fabrics, the US military spent considerable effort researching cold weather gear for troops deployed to places like Alaska and Northern Europe. What they eventually developed was a layering system, cotton or wool, next to skin wool insulation and a wind-resistant outer shell. They were essentially rediscovering what medieval shepherds had known for centuries. A training manual from 1943 titled Field Manual 3170, Basic Cold Weather Manual, includes instructions that would have made perfect sense to a 14th century shepherd. The principle of layering cannot be overemphasized. Multiple thin layers trap air between them and provide better insulation than a single thick layer of the same total material. Inner layers manage moisture, middle layers provide insulation, outer layers block wind. The manual doesn't cite medieval sources, of course. The researchers probably didn't even know they were reinventing ancient wheel. But truth has a way of being rediscovered because it's based on unchanging physical principles. As you lie there tonight, think about what you're wearing, what you're lying under. You probably have a mix of materials without even thinking about it. Maybe cotton sheets, a wool blanket, a synthetic comforter. You've unconsciously created a layering system guided by instincts that were shaped by thousands of years of human trial and error. And here's something worth considering. The people who taught us these lessons, they paid a high price for this knowledge. For every shepherd who survived by understanding material properties, how many others died before the lesson was learned? For every grandmother who could explain the right way to layer fabric, how many failed experiments resulted in a grandchild who never grew up? We take this knowledge for granted now. We have the luxury of experimentation without fatal consequences. Too cold one night, adjust tomorrow. But for them, getting it wrong once might mean not having a tomorrow. So when you combine your cotton and your wool and your quilted layers, when you mix and match materials to find what works best for you, you're standing on a foundation built by people who had no choice but to get it right. You're benefiting from wisdom that was purchased with lives refined through generations and passed down because teaching was survival. The grandmother in that Irish cottage during the famine, she couldn't explain thermodynamics or moisture vapor transmission. But she knew that cotton wool and quilted layers in that specific arrangement worked better than any single material. She knew it because her grandmother taught her, and because every night her family woke up alive when neighbors with simpler arrangements didn't always. That's the power of traditional knowledge. It doesn't need to explain itself. It just needs to work. And this knowledge, This understanding of how to combine materials for maximum warmth with minimum resources, it worked. It saved lives. It still can. As your breathing slows and sleep draws nearer, let yourself feel gratitude for this accumulated wisdom. You're warm tonight, partly because of your modern technology? Yes. But you're also warm because countless generations before you learned these lessons and taught them forward. You're warm because humanity has always been a teaching species, a species that passes on what works, even when we don't fully understand why it works. And that continuity, that connection across time, perhaps that's the warmest feeling of all. Not every shepherd had the luxury of a permanent shelter, no matter how rough. Some tended their flocks in territories so vast that movement was constant, following grass and water through landscapes that never quite felt like home. These nomadic shepherds developed their own adaptations techniques that worked when you had even less than nothing, when your shelter was whatever you could carry. Let me tell you about adaptability, about making warmth portable, about surviving in conditions that made even a drafty stone hut seem like luxury. In the mountainous regions between medieval Hungary and the Byzantine Empire, now modern-day Romania and Bulgaria, shepherd communities moved their flocks across hundreds of miles following seasonal patterns. These weren't random wanderings. They were sophisticated migrations that had been refined over centuries. Paths that avoided the worst weather found the best grazing, and included rest stops where generations of shepherds had camped before. But the shelters at these stops were minimal. Sometimes just a rock overhang. Sometimes nothing but open ground with whatever windbreak you could construct from branches or stones. The shepherds carried blankets, certainly, but not elaborate bedding. Everything had to be light enough to pack each morning and carry to the next stop. Here's what they learned when you can't build elaborate layering systems because you don't have enough materials, when you can't arrange a proper platform because you're sleeping on raw ground. You have to make your core protection even more efficient. You have to become essentially a self-contained thermal unit. The technique they developed was to fold extra material, whatever they had specifically under their torso. Not spread out over the entire sleeping area, not shared equally between top and bottom, but concentrated beneath the vital organs, beneath the part of your body that generates the most heat and needs the most protection. Why does this work so dramatically well? Remember that your torso is your furnace. It's producing heat constantly to keep those vital organs functioning. When you're lying down, the contact between your back and the ground creates a massive pathway for heat loss. That's the coldest you'll be, where your body presses against the earth. By folding additional layers specifically under your torso, say under your shoulder blades, down to your hips, you're dramatically reducing the heat loss from your most important area. It doesn't matter as much if your legs are a little colder or even your shoulders. Your body can tolerate some gradient in temperature. What it can't tolerate is core heat loss. There's an account from the year 1456, recorded by a merchant traveling through the Carpathian Mountains. He hired local shepherds as guides, and he wrote about his surprise at how they prepared for sleep each night. Though I had brought proper camping equipment from Vienna, he wrote, including a thick feather mattress and several blankets, I was miserably cold each night. My guides, who had only thin woolen cloaks and one blanket each, seemed comfortable. On the fourth night, one of them showed me their method. He folded his blanket so that half of its length was laid on the ground. Then he lay upon this folded half, so his back was cushioned by double fabric. Then he pulled the remaining half over his front and secured it. He slept curled slightly on his side. When I tried this method with my own blankets, abandoning my mattress, which I now understood was too thin to matter, I finally slept warm. That merchant learned what nomadic shepherds had known for generations. Concentration of resources is often better than distribution. A little bit of extra insulation in the right place does more good than a lot of insulation spread too thin. This principle applies whether you're sleeping on a modern camp cot with a thin mattress on a wooden platform, or even on a contemporary bed where the mattress itself doesn't provide adequate insulation. Adding extra folded layers under your torso transforms your thermal situation. Now there's a refinement to this technique that makes it even more effective, something that demonstrates the sophisticated understanding these shepherds had developed. When you fold extra material under your torso, if you do it correctly, you create not just insulation, but also a slight concave curve to your sleeping position. Your body naturally curves somewhat when you lie on your side, and by raising the middle section slightly, you support that natural curve while keeping your spine aligned. This does two things. First, it's more comfortable, which means you move less during sleep, which means you disturb your thermal layers less. Second, when you're lying on your side with proper support, your body can relax more completely, which reduces muscle tension, which reduces metabolic heat waste. Medieval shepherds didn't think about it in those terms, obviously. They just knew that when they arranged things this way, they slept better and woke less stiff. But the principle is sound. There's actually modern research that confirms this. Studies on traditional sleeping positions in cold climates, done by anthropologists studying contemporary nomadic herders in Mongolia and Afghanistan, show that the curled side sleeping position with extra padding under the torso is nearly universal among people who sleep in unheated conditions. It's not cultural, it's practical, it's what works. One particularly interesting detail from these modern studies, the researchers found that experienced herders positioned the folded padding slightly differently depending on the sleeping surface. On soft ground, they placed it from shoulder to hip. On hard ground, they extended it further toward the shoulders and neck. They were instinctively adjusting for the different thermal conductivity of different surfaces. This kind of nuanced adaptation suggests that what looked like simple survival techniques were actually quite sophisticated systems of environmental interaction. These weren't crude, desperate measures. They were refined practices honed through countless iterations, representing a deep understanding of how cold works and how the human body responds. Let me bring this forward to something you might face yourself. Imagine a winter power outage, not brief, not measured in hours, but days. Your home's heating system is useless. Your electric blankets won't work. You're facing nights in a house that's gradually cooling to match the outside temperature. This is when these nomadic techniques become valuable again. You might have a perfectly good bed, but if your mattress is memory foam or another modern material that compresses completely under your weight, it's providing almost no insulation from the base of the bed. The solution the nomads would have used: fold a thick blanket, a sleeping bag, or even layers of clothing to create a pad specifically under your torso. Combined with the layering techniques we've already discussed, this targeted padding can make the difference between a miserable, potentially dangerous night and one where you sleep reasonably well despite the circumstances. This is survival knowledge that deserves to be remembered, not because we expect to use it regularly, but because when you need it, you really need it. And unlike many survival skills that require special equipment or training, this one requires only understanding and whatever materials you have on hand. As you lie there now, in whatever warmth you found tonight, maybe take a moment to notice how your body is positioned. Are you on your side? Notice how your torso is supported. Even with a modern mattress, even in comfortable circumstances, your body seeks positions that minimize cold stress and maximize comfort. Those instincts are ancient. They're the same instincts that kept a nomadic shepherd alive in the Carpathian Mountains on a night in 1456. You are not so far removed from that shepherd. Just a few hundred years, a few thousand nights of sleep. Same body, same needs, same physics. Same fundamental challenge of maintaining warmth when the world wants to take it from you. And the same solutions waiting in memory, ready to be recalled when needed. That's worth something, isn't it? That's worth knowing, worth remembering, worth carrying forward just as countless others carried it forward to reach you. There's a particular quality to knowledge that's been tested by desperation. It's different from knowledge gained in comfort in laboratories in controlled conditions. When survival itself is the test, only what truly works persists. Tonight, we're exploring knowledge that survived because it had to wisdom that crossed generations, because people who ignored it didn't become ancestors. Let me tell you about inheritance not of property or position, but of understanding that meant life. In the winter of 1917, not medieval times, but living memory for some when I was young, much of Europe faced what they called the turnip winter. World War I had disrupted everything. Coal shipments were diverted to the military. Food was rationed to starvation levels. And that winter happened to be one of the coldest in a generation. In Germany, in France, in Britain, civilian populations faced winters without adequate heating fuel for the first time in several generations. Central heating was still rare, but even coal for fireplaces had become scarce. People who'd grown up in relative comfort suddenly had to remember or relearn techniques their grandparents had known, but they'd forgotten. And diary from that winter, kept by a schoolteacher in Munich named Helena Bauer, describes her gradual discovery of what she called the old ways. My grandmother came to stay with us, Helena wrote, and she saw how we were suffering in the cold. She laughed not unkindly and said we'd forgotten how to be poor. She showed us methods I'd never seen, though she swore her mother and grandmother had done them all their lives. What follows in Helena's diary is essentially a rediscovery of medieval winter survival techniques passed down through a direct line of German women going back centuries. The grandmother taught them to heat stones on their small cooking stove and wrap them in cloth to place at the foot of their beds. Taught them to drape blankets across doors to create smaller spaces within their apartment. Taught them the layering techniques we've discussed. And she taught them something about sleeping arrangements that had been common in Europe for centuries, but had been abandoned as poverty decreased communal sleeping. This is where we venture into territory that might seem uncomfortable to modern sensibilities, but it's too important to skip. For most of human history, sleeping alone was a luxury few could afford, and in winter it was sometimes a death sentence. Medieval families slept together not just for space efficiency, but for warmth. Parents, children, sometimes even trusted servants, in grand houses would share large beds or sleeping platforms. This wasn't about intimacy, it was about survival. Every additional body in a bed adds their heat output to the collective warmth. The physics here is straightforward. Each human body produces roughly 100 watts of heat continuously. Two bodies together in a confined space share that heat, effectively doubling the thermal output without doubling the heat loss. The efficiency increases with each additional person up to a point where crowding becomes counterproductive. Shepherd families in medieval times used this principle consistently. In their small stone shelters, the family would often sleep in one large bed or on one sleeping platform, arranged carefully to maximize heat sharing while maintaining some personal space. Children who produce less heat and lose heat faster due to their smaller mass would be positioned in the middle, flanked by adults on either side. There's a legal document from 14th century England, a property inventory, done after a death that describes a shepherd's cottage in Wales. The entire cottage was one room with a stone fireplace at one end and a raised sleeping platform at the other. The platform was described as large enough for the family being 6 souls to rest together in warmth. This wasn't unusual. This was standard. Military forces throughout history have also known this. When armies camped in winter, soldiers would be ordered to sleep close together, sometimes directly next to each other, sharing blankets and body heat. This wasn't about camaraderie, though that was a side benefit. It was about maintaining a fighting force in harsh conditions. A training manual from the US Army, published in 1951 during the Korean War, includes specific instructions on cold weather, bivouacking. Men should sleep in pairs or groups when possible, sharing sleeping bags or blankets if available. Body heat from 2 men in close proximity can raise the temperature of a shelter by several degrees. During the Korean War, winter temperatures in the mountains regularly dropped to -20 or 30 degrees Fahrenheit. American soldiers, many from warm climates who'd never experienced such cold, had to quickly learn these principles. Those who understood or were taught by experienced NCOs who remembered World War II winter campaigns fared much better than those who tried to tough it out alone. Let me share one particular account that demonstrates the power of this knowledge and the tragedy of its absence. In January 1951, at the Chosin Reservoir in North Korea, US, Marines found themselves surrounded and fighting in temperatures that dropped to -35 Fahrenheit. A Marine corporal named James Randall wrote a letter home after the battle describing what he'd learned. "The Chinese knew the cold better than we did," he wrote. "When we found their positions after they'd retreated, we saw how they bivouacked. 4 or 5 men to a hole pressed close together, sharing every blanket and coat they had between them. Meanwhile, we'd been spreading out, giving each other space like we would in the temperate zone. Once we learned to adapt to huddle like they did, our cold casualties dropped significantly." James Randall survived Chosin. His letter is preserved in the Marine Corps archives. And what he described as an innovation born of desperation was actually a technique that went back thousands of years to the first humans who figured out that being social wasn't just emotionally beneficial, but thermally efficient. Now I recognize that many of you listening tonight are sleeping alone. That's the modern reality for many people. So how does this knowledge help you? Even without another person, you can apply the same principle of creating a smaller warm space and using makeshift methods to retain heat. But there's something else worth thinking about. In an emergency, in a real survival situation, would you know to huddle together? Would you overcome the modern aversion to close proximity in order to survive? It's worth thinking about because someday it might matter. There's also a deeper lesson here about isolation. Modern life has given us unprecedented privacy and personal space. These are gifts, genuinely. But they've also distanced us from practices that were for most of history fundamental to survival. When we live alone, sleep alone, we lose something beyond just thermal efficiency. We lose the lived understanding that humans are fundamentally interdependent, that our strength has always come from working together, from sharing resources, from supporting each other through harsh conditions. Medieval shepherds understood this, not philosophically, but practically. Winter wasn't something you survived alone. It was something you survived together, as a family, as a community. Your warmth was their warmth. Their survival was your survival. And in some way, isn't that still true? The power grid that keeps your home warm, that's maintained by thousands of workers. The fuel that powers your heating extracted. Refined, delivered by countless hands. The blankets and clothes you use, made by people you'll never meet. We're still dependent on each other. We've just hidden the connections behind layers of technology and infrastructure. But when those systems fail, when winter strips away the comfortable illusions, we rediscover quickly what our ancestors always knew. Warmth is communal. Survival is shared. We make it through the night together, or we don't make it through at all. As your eyes grow heavier, a sleep finally begins to claim you. Hold this thought, you're not alone. Not really. You're connected through time, through shared knowledge, through the simple fact of being human in a world that requires warmth to everyone who's ever faced a cold night and found a way through it. And maybe that's enough. Maybe knowing you're part of that long chain of survivors, that your comfort tonight stands on the foundation of their hard-won wisdom. Maybe that brings its own kind of warmth. Not the kind you can measure in degrees. The kind you feel in your heart when you realize you belong to something larger than yourself. Something that stretches back through the centuries and forward into a future you'll never see, but are helping to shape. Rest now. Rest in the warmth of that belonging. Let it enfold you like an extra blanket, invisible but real. You've earned it. We all have. There's a paradox at the heart of warmth, something that seems impossible until you understand it deeply. The very thing that keeps you alive, the air you breathe, is also the medium through which your heat escapes. And yet, that same air, when trapped and stilled, becomes your greatest ally against the cold. Tonight, let's explore this paradox, this dance between heat and the invisible ocean we live within. Close your eyes for a moment, if you haven't already. Feel your breath moving in and out. That breath carries water vapor from deep in your lungs, warmth from your core out into the world. Every exhale is a tiny loss of heat. Over the course of a night, you lose a surprising amount of warmth just through breathing. Medieval shepherds couldn't see this happening, of course. They didn't have thermal cameras or scientific instruments, but they understood it intuitively through observation and experience. They noticed that on very cold nights, they could see their breath as clouds of vapor. They noticed that these clouds rose and dissipated, and they understood in a practical sense that warmth was escaping. So they learned to sleep in positions that minimized this loss. curled slightly perhaps, with a portion of their blanket or cloak drawn over their mouth and nose, creating a space where exhaled air would be partially trapped and rebreathed, warming the incoming breath before it reached their lungs. This is dangerous if done wrong, which is why I need to be careful explaining it. You never want to restrict breathing. You never want to create a situation where you're rebreathing too much of your exhaled carbon dioxide. But creating a small dead airspace near your face, one that mixes fresh air with slightly warmed exhaled air that's safe and effective. Modern cold weather gear incorporates this principle. Balaclavas, face masks, even sleeping bag hoods are designed to create this warming effect. But long before these were manufactured products, people learned to use fabric scarves or just the arrangement of their covering to achieve the same result. There's a fascinating account from the diaries of a British explorer named Ernest Shackleton, who led Antarctic expeditions in the early 20th century. While not medieval, his observations about sleeping in extreme cold are illuminating, because he was essentially rediscovering principles that cold climate dwellers had known for millennia. Shackleton wrote about sleeping in temperatures far below zero in conditions where any mistake could be fatal. He described the technique his team developed. We learned to create a breathing space within our sleeping bags that captured some warmth from our exhalations without becoming dangerously enclosed. This small pocket of warmed air made an astonishing difference. The first breath upon waking, instead of burning our lungs with cold, was merely cool. What Shackleton was describing without realizing, it was a technique Inuit peoples had perfected over thousands of years, that Mongolian herders knew that Scandinavian fishermen understood. The principle transcends culture because it transcends human invention. It's physics. It's the behavior of gases, the movement of heat principles that were true before humans evolved and will remain true long after we're gone. But let's return to our medieval shepherd, because there's more to understand about air and warmth than just breathing. Think about the space around you as you lie in your shelter. In a modern home, air circulates constantly. Your HVAC system ensures this. Warm air is pumped in, cold air expelled, everything kept moving and filtered. But in a medieval shelter, air movement was minimal. Unless wind was blowing through gaps, the air inside remained relatively still. Still air is a terrible conductor of heat. This is crucial to understand. When air isn't moving, when it's trapped in small spaces between fibers or between layers, it forms an insulating barrier. But when air moves, when it creates convection currents, it carries heat away efficiently. Medieval shelters, despite their numerous gaps and drafts, actually had one advantage over some modern homes. They were small. A shepherd's stone hut might be only 10 or 12 feet across. A family cottage might have only one main room. This limited volume meant that body heat could warm the air relatively quickly, and if the worst drafts were blocked, that warmth would persist. The shepherds learned to use strategic blocking. A cloak hung over the doorway, moss or wool scraps stuffed into the worst gaps in the stone walls. Not perfect ceiling, which would have created dangerous air quality problems, but enough to stop the worst convective heat loss. And here's something beautiful about human adaptation. They learned to judge the right balance. Too sealed, and the air became stuffy, unhealthy, dangerous. Too open and warmth escaped faster than body heat could replace it. They learned through trial and error, refined over generations, exactly how much air exchange was needed for safety without sacrificing too much warmth. There's a record from a Scottish estate in the 1700s where the laird hired an architect to improve the shepherds' cottages. The architect, educated in the new Georgian styles, built cottages with larger rooms, higher ceilings, and proper windows. The shepherds hated them. They were colder, they complained, more difficult to heat. They actually petitioned to have the old, small, primitive cottages restored. The laird, to his credit, asked why. One old shepherd explained, "A wee room holds warmth like a cupped hand holds water. Your grand rooms, sir, they scatter heat like water poured on sand. We cannae warm what's too big to hold." That shepherd understood something the educated architect didn't. Volume matters. The ratio of surface area to enclosed volume determines how efficiently a space can be heated and how quickly it loses heat. Small spaces are more efficient. This is why modern efficient home designs often favor smaller, well-insulated rooms over grand open floor plans in cold climates. It's also why, in survival situations, you want to make your sleeping space as small as practicable. Don't try to heat an entire room. Heat just the space your body occupies. Create a microclimate. This principle extends to the very clothing you wear to sleep. Loose, baggy clothing allows air to circulate next to your skin, carrying away heat. Closer-fitting layers trap air against your body, letting it warm without the constant loss through circulation. Medieval people didn't wear pajamas as we know them. They often slept in the same linen or wool undergarments they wore during the day, or sometimes in a longer version of these. These garments were relatively fitted compared to outer clothing, and they understood that this was important for retaining warmth. Let me share something that connects all these ideas about air and warmth, something that reveals how sophisticated this traditional knowledge actually was. In the Swiss Alps, there's a tradition of winter shelters called Alphütten. Small huts used by herders who stayed with their flocks in mountain pastures during the warmer months, but needed emergency shelter during unexpected autumn or spring snowstorms. These huts were built using techniques passed down for centuries. An anthropologist in the 1960s studied these huts and interviewed elderly herders who remembered using them in their youth before modern roads made them obsolete. One herder, a man named Jacob Müller, described the sleeping arrangements in detail. The sleeping platform was built close to the ceiling, perhaps only 3 or 4 feet below it. This seemed strange to the anthropologist, until Jacob explained, warm air rises. If you sleep on the ground, you sleep in cold. But up near the roof, you sleep in the warmest air the hut contains. And the low ceiling above you, it captures your body heat, reflects it back. You're sleeping in a pocket of your own warmth. This is thermodynamic efficiency at its finest, achieved without any formal education in physics. Jacob and his ancestors had simply observed, remembered, and taught the patterns that worked. When you think about it, every traditional cold climate dwelling incorporates these principles. Igloos built by Inuit peoples have raised sleeping platforms. Mongolian yurts concentrate sleeping areas in the warmest sections. Scandinavian timber cottages often had built-in box beds, essentially closable cupboards with bedding inside, creating a microspace within the larger room. These aren't coincidences. They're not cultural oddities. They're solutions to the same problem arrived at independently, because physics doesn't change based on culture. Cold behaves the same everywhere. Heat loss follows the same rules whether you're in Alaska, Mongolia, or Norway. And the beautiful thing, the thing that should comfort you as you lie there tonight, is that you still have access to this knowledge. It hasn't been lost. It's just been set aside, temporarily forgotten, because modern technology made it seem unnecessary. But knowledge doesn't expire. Understanding doesn't become obsolete. The principles that kept a medieval shepherd warm are the same principles that could keep you warm if your modern systems fail. And knowing that having that understanding ready in your mind, that's a form of security no technology can provide. As your breathing slows further, as sleep draws closer, still let yourself marvel a bit at how elegant it all is. Heat, air, simple materials, human understanding, nothing high-tech, nothing that requires factories or supply chains, just observation, memory, and application. You are right now experiencing what billions of humans have experienced before you, the gentle transition from waking to sleep, the gradual warming of your immediate environment, the triumph of ordered heat over chaotic cold. It's mundane and miraculous at once. Let that paradox cradle you. Let the invisible air around you, that medium of potential heat loss, become instead your ally, your insulator, your silent guardian against the night's chill. It's there. It's always been there. You just have to know how to trap it, how to still it, how to make it work for you instead of against you. And now you know. Now you understand. And that understanding, like warmth itself, is something worth holding close. There's a strange thing that happens when life becomes comfortable. Knowledge that once seemed essential begins to feel quaint, then historical, then forgotten entirely. Not because the knowledge was wrong, but because circumstances made it seem unnecessary. Tonight, we're examining what we lost when we gained central heating, and why remembering might matter more than we think. Imagine for a moment that you're a child born in 1925. The world you'd grow up in would be on the cusp of massive change. Electric heating was starting to reach homes, at least in cities. Central heating systems were being installed in new construction. Within your lifetime, the fundamental relationship between humans and winter warmth would transform completely. Your grandparents, born perhaps in the 1860s or 1870s, would have grown up managing cold in ways that were still essentially medieval. They would have known every technique we've discussed tonight, not from books or videos, but from necessary practice. They would have taught your parents, who would have taught you, but with decreasing urgency each generation. Because by the time you were teaching your own children, born perhaps in the 1950s or 1960s, these skills seemed archaic, unnecessary, almost embarrassing in their primitiveness. There's a social historian named Ruth Schwartz Cowan who wrote about this phenomenon. She called it the invisible transition, how basic life skills vanish within just 2 or 3 generations once the conditions that necessitated them change. She was writing about domestic technology primarily, but the principle applies perfectly to thermal management. In 1920, nearly everyone in Europe and North America knew how to build and maintain a fire, how to manage coal or wood fuel, how to layer bedding for maximum warmth, how to survive a cold night with minimal resources. By 1960, these skills existed primarily in rural areas. By 2000, they'd become the domain of enthusiasts, historical reenactors, survivalists, outdoor adventurers. But here's what's fascinating and slightly troubling. The infrastructure that replaced this knowledge is more fragile than we like to admit. A modern home's heating system depends on a functioning electrical grid or a steady supply of natural gas or delivered heating oil. These are complex systems requiring constant maintenance, vulnerable to extreme weather, dependent on everything from power plants to pipelines to delivery trucks. When they work, they're marvelous. When they fail completely and immediately. A shepherd in 1450 Scotland had no such systems to fail. His methods were robust precisely because they were simple. If his wool blanket tore, he could patch it. If his shelter developed new gaps, he could stuff them with whatever was at hand. His survival strategy had no single point of failure, no off switch. This isn't an argument for abandoning modern heating. I'm not suggesting we return to medieval living conditions. But it is an argument for maintaining knowledge diversity, for not letting understanding disappear completely just because it's currently unnecessary. There's a community in upstate New York that experienced this lesson dramatically in 1998. A severe ice storm knocked out power to hundreds of thousands of homes for up to 2 weeks in January. Modern homes dependent entirely on electric heating became uninhabitable within hours as temperatures inside dropped to match the outside air, which hovered around 0 Fahrenheit. A journalist who covered the disaster interviewed residents after it was over. She found an interesting pattern elderly people, those old enough to remember. Before universal central heating generally fared much better. They knew to create small warm spaces within larger cold houses. They knew layering techniques. They knew to use thermal mass heating stones on their gas cooking stoves and using them as bed warmers. They had knowledge that younger residents simply didn't possess. One woman, 86 years old at the time, told the journalist, "My mother grew up without electricity at all. She taught me how to manage cold. I never thought I'd need it again living in America in the modern world. But I did need it, and it saved me." That woman's mother would have been born around 1900, would have learned from her mother who was born perhaps in the 1870s, who learned from her mother born in the 1840s. That's a chain of knowledge transmission going back to a time when these techniques were still evolving, still being refined from even older medieval practices. 4 generations of women, each teaching the next, until the knowledge proved its value in 1998. But how many chains broke? How many people in that ice storm didn't have grandmothers who remembered mothers who taught? How many suffered unnecessarily because the knowledge had been lost in their family line? This matters today in 2025, perhaps more than it has in decades. Climate instability is increasing the frequency of extreme weather events. Aging infrastructure is becoming more vulnerable. The electrical grid, stressed by increasing demand and deferred maintenance, faces more frequent failures. The cozy assumption that heating will always be available is becoming less certain. I'm not trying to frighten you. Fear isn't useful here. Understanding is useful. Preparation is useful. And the beautiful thing about the knowledge we've explored tonight is that it requires no significant investment, no special equipment. It just requires attention and memory. You can test these techniques tonight, right now, in complete safety. Try arranging your blankets as we've discussed. Try creating the thermal core, the layered system, the focused insulation. See if you feel warmer. See if you sleep better. You lose nothing by trying, and you gain knowledge that might someday, when you least expect it, prove invaluable. There's another aspect to this worth considering. By remembering and occasionally practicing these skills, you maintain a connection to historical reality that's increasingly rare. You understand in a visceral way what winter meant to your ancestors. You gain perspective on how remarkably comfortable modern life is, which can foster gratitude and reduce the taking for granted that makes us unhappy. When you know you could survive uncomfortable conditions, when you felt how effective simple techniques can be, the minor annoyances of modern life feel less oppressive. The thermostat set a bit lower to save energy doesn't feel like suffering anymore. It feels like a minor adjustment easily managed with knowledge you possess. Historical reenactors understand this. People who spend weekends at medieval fairs or historical sites, sleeping in period-accurate conditions, they often report that the experience is valuable precisely because it builds this perspective and confidence. They're not delusional about the past. They know life was harder. But they've learned that harder doesn't necessarily mean impossible. It just means different, requiring different knowledge and approaches. A friend of mine who does Revolutionary War reenactments once told me about sleeping in a canvas tent in February at a historic site in Pennsylvania. He used exactly the techniques we've discussed: wool ground layer, careful layering of blankets, thermal core positioning, strategic air management. I was prepared for misery, he told me. But I was actually comfortable. Not luxury comfortable, but genuinely fine. And it completely changed how I thought about history. These people weren't superhuman. They just knew things we've forgotten, and those things worked. That's the veil we're trying to lift tonight. The veil that makes the past seem impossibly harsh, that makes our ancestors seem either superhuman in their endurance or pathetic in their suffering. The truth is simpler and more empowering. They were people like you, with bodies like yours, with needs like yours. They just had different knowledge and different tools. And some of that knowledge, the core of it, is still perfectly valid and useful. As you lie there, warmer now than when we started this journey together, think about what you've learned. Not academic learning, though. There's been some of that. But the felt sense of how these techniques work, the understanding you've gained through actually experiencing the adjustments to your own warmth. You're now part of a chain, even if unconsciously. You've heard knowledge that was passed down through generations, and even if you never deliberately teach anyone else, you carry it now. It's in you, available, ready. And perhaps someday in circumstances, neither of us can predict that knowledge will serve you or someone you share it with. That's not a small thing. That's worth staying awake for a few more minutes to appreciate. The veil of forgetting is thin. It can be lifted with just attention and practice. And when it lifts, you see more clearly not just the past, but the present. Not just history, but your own place in the ongoing human story of adaptation and survival. So, let's not forget. Let's remember deliberately. Let's value what worked for centuries just because modern alternatives are currently available. Let's maintain knowledge diversity the way we maintain biological diversity as insurance against unknown futures. As respect for what brought us to this moment, as connection to the unbroken chain of human survival that stretches back to our first ancestors who learned to use fire and forward to descendants we'll never meet. You're a link in that chain now. Rest in that knowledge. Let it warm you from within a different kind of heat, just as real. We've traveled far tonight through centuries and across continents, following the thread of warmth through human history. Now, as sleep finally claims you, let's bring it all together. See how these separate techniques weave into a complete system, elegant in its simplicity, profound in its effectiveness. As we reach the end of our journey, imagine the final layers Callum adds. He reaches for a piece of cured sheepskin. He doesn't lay it over him with the wool facing out to show the world. Instead, he turns the fur inward against his own body. He feels the soft, dense wool fibers interlock with his own clothing. This fur inward technique is an ancient secret, creating a micro-environment where his skin directly interacts with the animal's natural insulation. Imagine you're standing outside yourself for a moment, looking at your sleeping form. If we could see heat the way infrared cameras do, what would we see? We'd see your body glowing, producing that steady 100 watts of thermal energy. We'd see that warmth trying to escape in every direction, down into whatever surface you're lying on, out through the air around you, radiating toward any cold surfaces nearby. Now listen closely to the environment he has created. Outside, the wind screams through the mountain passes, and the snow piles against the door. But inside, there is a profound, heavy peace. You can hear the faint, rhythmic ticking of the cooling hearthstones. You can hear the slow, deep sighs of the sheep huddled in the corner. You can hear the soft rustle of straw as Callum shifts one last time. He is wearing his thick nightcap, his head cradled in a nest of wool and air. His breath creates a small warm cloud that lingers for a moment before disappearing. He thinks of his grandfather and his grandfather before him, all sleeping in this same way, using these same silent defenses. He is not a man struggling against nature. He is a man in harmony with it. But we'd also see barriers. We'd see that thin layer beneath you interrupting the flow of heat to the ground. We'd see the trapped air between your carefully layered blankets glowing slightly warmer than the air outside them. We'd see the focused insulation under your torso creating a bright spot of retained heat. We'd see different materials working in combination, each contributing its unique properties to the whole system. Feel that same harmony now. Your bed is your shelter. Your blankets are your layers. The wisdom of the shepherds is yours to keep. The sounds of the modern world are fading away, replaced by the internal rhythm of your own slow, steady breathing. You are warm. You are safe. You are part of a long, unbroken line of survivors who knew how to find the light in the middle of a dark winter. And we'd see something remarkable. We'd see that your body isn't fighting a losing battle anymore. The heat you produce isn't pouring uselessly into the void. It's being captured, retained, cycled back. You've created a microclimate, a pocket of warmth in a cold world, using nothing but understanding and simple materials. This is the harmony the shepherds achieved. Not through any single brilliant innovation, but through the patient accumulation of small advantages, each technique building on the others, creating something greater than the sum of its parts. Let's trace through it one final time, not as separate lessons, but as one integrated system. You begin with awareness of the ground. You know it's the greatest threat, the biggest pathway for heat loss. So you address it first, creating that barrier, that interruption in the thermal pathway. This is your foundation. Everything else builds on this. Next, you create your layers. Not piling, not random accumulation, but deliberate arrangement. Each layer serves a purpose. The first manages moisture while staying next to your skin. The middle layers trap air, creating invisible insulation. The outer layers hold everything in place and block wind. Then you focus your resources. You recognize that your core is what matters most, so you concentrate extra insulation there. You don't spread yourself thin, trying to warm everything equally. You prioritize just as your own body prioritizes when under stress. You mix your materials, understanding that diversity provides resilience. Cotton and wool and quilted layers, each compensating for the other's weaknesses, each contributing their strengths. No single perfect material, just smart combinations. And finally, you manage air itself. You create stillness where you need it, trapping air in layers, in fabric, weave in the space around your body. You allow just enough circulation to remain safe, but not so much that warmth escapes. You position yourself to minimize heat loss from breathing while keeping that breath easy and natural. Each technique alone is helpful. Together, they're transformative. There's a concept in engineering called defense in depth. It's the idea that you don't rely on any single protection. Instead, you create multiple layers of security so that if one fails, others remain. Nuclear reactors use this principle. So do computer networks. So do castles with their multiple walls and gates. Medieval shepherds, without knowing the terminology, practiced defense in depth against cold. They didn't trust their survival to any single method. They used everything they knew, every technique they'd learned, creating redundancy and resilience. And this approach has a psychological benefit too. When you know you've done everything you reasonably can, when you've applied every technique, layered every defense, your mind can rest. You're not lying awake, wondering if you should adjust something, add something, try something different. You've done what works. Now you can let go and trust the system. This matters for sleep quality, perhaps, as much as the physical warmth. Anxiety about being cold can keep you awake almost as effectively as being cold itself. But confidence, the knowledge that you're protected, that you've created a secure microclimate that allows true rest. I think this might be why traditional people in cold climates often report sleeping better than we do with all our modern technology. It's not that they were more comfortable physically, they almost certainly weren't. But they had confidence in their methods, built through lifetimes of experience. They knew these techniques worked because they'd proven it night after night. So they could release worry and surrender to sleep. You can have that same confidence, not built over a lifetime yet perhaps, but begun tonight. You've felt these principles in action. You've experienced how effective they are. That's the start of genuine knowing, the kind that comes from experience rather than just information. And here's a final thought to carry into sleep. This knowledge you've gained tonight, it's not just about survival. It's about competence, about expanding your capabilities, about knowing you can manage situations you might have thought were beyond you. There's something deeply satisfying about learning practical skills, about gaining understanding that has tangible effects. In our information-saturated world, where so much of what we learn is abstract or theoretical, there's a particular pleasure in knowledge that you can apply immediately that changes your actual lived experience right now. You're warmer tonight because of what you've learned and applied. Not someday, not potentially, but actually warmer right now. That's rare and valuable. And it points to something larger. the continued relevance of traditional knowledge, the value of historical understanding, the way the past and present can inform each other to everyone's benefit. The shepherds who developed these techniques are long gone. Their shelters have crumbled, their blankets have turned to dust, but their understanding remains passed forward through exactly this kind of sharing, this kind of teaching, this kind of remembering. And now you carry it. You're part of that transmission now, whether you intended to be or not. The knowledge is in your mind, has been tested by your body, proven through your own experience. It's yours, and someday perhaps you'll pass it on. Maybe deliberately teaching someone who needs to know. Maybe just by example, by demonstrating that you can be comfortable in conditions others find difficult. However it happens, the chain continues. Knowledge persists. Understanding flows forward through time. And humanity, that clever, adaptable teaching species, remains capable of surviving winter's assault through nothing more complex than wool, air, and accumulated wisdom. As your breathing deepens, as the consciousness begins its nightly fade, as the warmth you've created holds you in its invisible embrace, let yourself feel satisfaction. You've learned something valuable tonight. You've connected with a long history of human adaptation. You've proven to yourself that simple things well understood and properly applied can be remarkably effective. These aren't mere tricks or clever hacks. They're fundamental truths about heat, about bodies, about the physical world we inhabit. They were true for medieval shepherds. They were true for soldiers in trenches, for families during the Depression, for anyone who's ever faced a cold night with limited resources. And they're true for you tonight, wherever you might be. That continuity, that connection across time and circumstance, perhaps that's the deepest warmth of all. Not just physical comfort, though that matters, but the warmth of belonging to something larger than yourself, of being part of the human story of sharing in accumulated wisdom that makes survival possible and sometimes even comfortable. Hold that warmth close. Let it mix with the physical warmth you've created through layering and positioning and understanding. Let them become indistinguishable, body and spirit, both at rest, both protected, both secure. The night is long, but you're prepared for it now. The cold is patient, but you're defended against it. And morning will come, as it always does, bringing light and warmth of its own. But until then, you have this knowledge, comfort, and the quiet satisfaction of understanding how our ancestors survived the darkness. Rest well. You've earned it. We all have. The first light of morning always comes as something of a surprise, doesn't it? No matter how many times you've watched night transition today, there's always that moment of awakening, that slow return to consciousness when you're not quite sure where you are or what time it is. For a medieval shepherd, that moment of waking had particular significance. It meant survival. It meant you'd made it through another night, that the cold hadn't claimed you, that you'd lived to see your flock, your family, your work another day. That might seem melodramatic from the comfort of our modern world. But the truth is, we're not so different. Every night's sleep is still a small victory, a successful navigation of vulnerability. We're unconscious, helpless in many ways, dependent on our preparations and our environment for safety. We trust that we'll wake, but that trust is an act of faith repeated every time we close our eyes. The shepherds we've journeyed with tonight, they understood this. They approached sleep with seriousness, with care, with attention to detail that reflected its importance. They didn't take survival for granted. They prepared for each night as if it mattered, because it did. And perhaps there's wisdom in that approach for us as well. Not fear or anxiety, but simply attention. Recognition that rest matters, that comfort matters, that understanding how to create both with minimal resources is knowledge worth having. I want to leave you with a question, one you don't need to answer now, but one worth carrying forward into your days ahead. If tonight the power went out and didn't come back on for a week, if your heating system failed during a winter storm, if you found yourself dependent solely on the materials in your home and the knowledge in your head, would you be comfortable? Would you be safe? Would you know what to do? Not to worry you, but to inspire you to think, to prepare, to value the kind of knowledge we've explored tonight. Because these skills, these techniques, they're not just historical curiosities. They're practical tools that work as well today as they did centuries ago, that might someday bridge the gap between discomfort and comfort, between danger and safety. The medieval shepherd facing a winter night in the Highlands had a clarity we often lack. He knew the stakes, knew what worked, knew his survival depended on applying knowledge correctly. We have the luxury of not usually facing such clear stakes. But that luxury can breed complacency, can make us forget that underneath all our technology, we're still vulnerable creatures in a sometimes hostile environment. Remembering keeps us humble. Practicing keeps us capable. Understanding keeps us connected to the long history of human adaptation and survival. As morning fully arrives wherever you are, as another night passes into memory as you go about your day, maybe take a moment now and then to notice warmth. Notice how your home is heated, what that requires, what would happen if it stopped. Notice how you dress for cold, whether you're using traditional principles without realizing it. Notice what you take for granted that generations before us would have considered miraculous luxury. And maybe share something of what you've learned tonight. Not preach, not lecture, but just mention to someone casually that you learned something interesting about medieval winter survival. Plant a seed. Continue the chain. Because that's how knowledge persists, through casual sharing, as much as formal teaching, through conversation and story, as much as instruction. The shepherds and farmers and soldiers whose techniques we've explored tonight, they'd probably be amazed by our world, by central heating and electric blankets and all the rest. But I like to think they'd also be pleased to know their hard-won knowledge hasn't been completely forgotten, that somewhere people still value and remember how they survived winters that seem almost mythically harsh to our modern sensibilities. You've honored them tonight by listening, by learning, by caring enough to spend time understanding what they knew. That's not nothing. That's a form of respect, of remembrance that keeps their struggles meaningful and their solutions alive. So thank you for that. Thank you for journeying back with me through cold and darkness to find warmth and light. Thank you for being willing to learn from the past, to value traditional knowledge, to maintain skills that modernity tried to make obsolete but never quite succeeded. If you found value in tonight's exploration, if you feel warmer and more secure in your understanding, I'd be grateful if you'd share this with someone who might benefit. Share it with a friend who loves history, with family members who remember harder times, with younger people who might never have thought about these questions. The chain continues through us, through these small acts of teaching and sharing. Subscribe if if you'd like more journeys like this, more excursions into the practical wisdom of the past. Like the video if it helped you sleep, if it gave you peace or understanding, or just a pleasant way to pass the evening hours. Comment and let me know what you'd like to learn about next. What corners of history call to your curiosity? But most importantly, rest. Rest, knowing you're connected to something larger than yourself, something that stretches back through countless generations and forward into a future you're helping to shape. Rest knowing that simple knowledge simply applied can make the difference between comfort and suffering, between fear and confidence. Rest, knowing that warmth isn't just about temperature, isn't just about blankets and insulation and carefully trapped air. It's also about connection, about belonging to the human family across time, about sharing in the accumulated wisdom that makes survival not just possible, but sometimes even comfortable. The night is over. Day has come. And you're here, warm and rested, ready for whatever awaits. That's victory enough. The same victory countless humans before you have won, the same victory countless more will win in nights yet to come. Sleep well when next you rest. Stay warm. And remember, you know more than you think you do. You're more capable than you've been told. And the wisdom of the past is always available, waiting patiently for anyone willing to listen, to learn, to remember. Until next time, this has been Peter Miller, honored to have shared this journey with you. Thank you for your company in the darkness. Thank you for listening to Whispers from the Past. And thank you for carrying this knowledge forward into your tomorrow. May your blankets be warm, your sleep be deep, and your dreams be peaceful. Good night.